I pinned the silver brooch onto my cream blazer and prepared to attend the memorial dinner organized by my own daughter. But just before I left the house, my late husband's attorney called, his voice suddenly low and serious. "Don't step into that house before you see me. There's a truth you absolutely need to know." An hour later, he placed a DNA report in front of me, then opened more files that made my chest tighten so badly I could barely breathe. But that night, I still walked into the dinner smiling, as if I knew nothing at all. Your being here means more than you know, thank you. Now tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you joining from today? Your city, your country. I want to see it all. Please note, some details in this story are fictional, added to enrich the narrative for educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or places is coincidental. The wisdom, however, is entirely intentional. The brooch had always been the last thing I put on. That was a habit Julian started back in the early years of our marriage, when he used to stand in the doorway of our bedroom and watch me get ready. He said a woman should dress herself completely before adding the finishing touch. Otherwise, what was the point of a finishing touch at all? I never argued with him about that. There were plenty of other things to argue about. But that particular habit stayed with me long after he was gone, the way certain habits do, when the person who gave them to you is no longer around to take them back. I stood in front of the mirror in our upstairs bedroom, my bedroom now just mine for the past 11 years, and fastened the last button on my cream wool blazer. The afternoon light came through the white linen curtains, the way it always does in late November in Charleston, thin and golden and already tired, like it knew the day was almost over. I looked at myself the way I had learned to look at things over 40 years of insurance appraisal work, without judgment, without sentiment, just observation. 70 years old, white hair pinned back the way I liked it, hands steady enough, eyes still sharp. I reached for the brooch on the dresser, silver shaped like a laurel branch, the kind of craftsmanship you simply do not find anymore. Julian gave it to me in 1987, the year we moved into this house on Battery Row. I turned it over once in my fingers before pinning it to my lapel. I was going to Claire's for dinner. She had organized what she called a family gathering, a quiet evening, to mark the 10th anniversary of Julian's passing. That was the kind of thing Claire did, the kind of thoughtfulness I had always admired in her. She had her father's eye for occasion. I had spent the better part of the afternoon deciding between two blazers and had settled on the cream one because Claire once told me it was her favorite. Small things like that still mattered to me. I supposed they always would. I went downstairs to the kitchen, filled a glass of water from the tap, and stood at the window looking out at the back garden. The rose bushes along the south wall had gone bare for the season, just brown stems and the memory of color. I made a note to prune them before Christmas. Movement caught my eye at the fence line. My neighbor Ruth Bellamy was out in her yard despite the chill, dragging a hose toward her potted camellias. Ruth had lived next door for nearly 20 years. She was the kind of woman who noticed things, who knew which days I went to church, which mornings I walked to the post office, and which evenings I sat on the porch long enough that she would bring over a second cup of coffee without being asked. She looked up and saw me through the glass. We waved at each other. Nothing more was needed. I set the glass down and checked the time. 6 minutes past 4. I had planned to leave by 1:30. My phone was on the kitchen counter screen, down the way I always left it when I wanted an hour of quiet. I turned it over to check for messages from Claire. She sometimes sent last-minute instructions about parking or which entrance to use, and saw instead a name I had not expected. Graham Vale, attorney at law. Graham had been Julian's lawyer for more than 2 decades. He was a careful, methodical man, the kind who sent formal letters when an email would do, and who never called without an appointment unless the matter was something that could not wait for an appointment. In 11 years of handling Julian's estate, he had called me unannounced exactly twice, once when the probate court required an urgent signature, and once when a clerical error nearly caused a tax penalty that would have cost me considerably. I answered on the second ring. "Marianne." His voice was lower than usual, and there was something underneath it that I could not immediately name. Not urgency exactly, something more careful than urgency. "Are you still at home?" "I am," I said. "I'm about to leave for Claire's. Is something wrong with the estate paperwork?" A pause, just a half-second too long. "I need you to come to my office, right now before you go anywhere else." He stopped as if he were choosing his next words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground. "Please don't go to Claire's tonight. Not yet. Not until you've been here first." I set the water glass down on the counter without meaning to make a sound, but it clicked against the tile anyway. "Graham, what is this about?" "I can't explain over the phone. I know how that sounds. I know it's not the way I usually do things." Another pause and then quieter. "Marianne, I have been Julian's attorney for 23 years. I have kept certain things in confidence because that was my professional obligation. But there is information you need before you walk into that house tonight. Information that cannot wait." The kitchen felt very still. Outside I could hear Ruth's hose running. "How long have you known?" I asked. I was not sure why I asked it that way. I did not yet know what I was asking about. But something in the way he spoke told me this was not new. This was something that had been sitting somewhere waiting. He did not answer the question directly. He said, "Please come now. I'll be at the door when you arrive." I hung up. I stood there for a moment, looking at the laurel brooch on my lapel. Then I picked up my keys, turned off the kitchen light, and walked out to the car. Graham's office was on the third floor of a red brick building on Broad Street, the kind of building that had been standing long enough to have opinions about the people who worked inside it. The elevator was slow and smelled faintly of old paper and wood polish. I had been here dozens of times over the years to sign estate documents, to review investment disclosures, to handle the ordinary paperwork that accumulates when a marriage ends not in divorce, but in death. I had never once arrived without calling ahead. He was waiting at the door of his office when I stepped off the elevator, just as he said he would be. The moment I saw his face, something cold moved through my chest. Graham Vail was a composed man by nature and by profession. In 23 years, I had seen him rattled exactly once the morning of Julian's funeral, when he stood at the back of the church with his jaw working like he was trying to hold something in. He looked like that now. Older somehow than the last time I had seen him 3 months ago. His collar was open at the top button, his tie loosened, and he was holding a manila envelope against his side, the way you hold something you are not sure you want to hand over. "Marianne." He stepped back to let me in. "Thank you for coming." "You didn't give me much choice," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. He closed the door behind us. The office was warm lit by the amber desk lamp I had always associated with late evening meetings and difficult conversations. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, the one I had sat in so many times before, and I sat down without taking off my coat. He placed the envelope on the desk between us. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he pressed both palms flat against the desk and looked directly at me. "Julian gave me this in 2014, he said. "The year before he died. He told me to keep it sealed unless one specific condition was met." He drew a slow breath. He said, and I am quoting because I have read it enough times to remember it exactly, "Open it only if Claire tries to take what belongs to Marianne." My fingers tightened around the strap of my handbag. "And you believe that condition has been met?" "I do not believe it," Graham said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I know it has been." He opened the envelope. The contents came out in careful order, the way Graham did everything first. A document printed on clinical white paper, 3 pages dense with technical language, and a laboratory header I recognized immediately from my appraisal days, the kind of formatting used by accredited testing facilities. A DNA analysis report. I did not need to read every line to understand what I was looking at, but I read every line anyway because that was the only way I knew how to face something that was dismantling me from the inside. Claire Whitlock Pierce. Marianne Whitlock. Probability of biological relationship, 0.0%. I set the pages down on the desk. My hands were not shaking. I was almost surprised by that. My hands were perfectly still, and somewhere behind my sternum, something that had been quietly alive for 39 years went very, very quiet. "She's not mine," I said. The words tasted like nothing, like paper, like the air in a room where a window has just been opened in winter. "She is Julian's," Graham said carefully, "but not yours, biologically." He paused, then pressed on because Graham always pressed on when stopping would have been easier. "Her mother is a woman named Mara Voss. Julian had a relationship with her before and briefly during the early years of your marriage." I stood up from the chair. I did not mean to. My legs simply decided the conversation required standing. I walked to the window and looked out at Broad Street below at the evening traffic and the lit storefronts and the perfectly ordinary world continuing to be perfectly ordinary while mine rearranged itself completely. "He told me Claire was ours," I said. My voice was tight now, pulled thin like wire stretched too far. "He held her in the hospital. He cried. I watched him cry, Graham." "I know." "He cried." My throat burned. I pressed 2 fingers against my lips because I was not going to fall apart in this office, not yet, not until I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. He looked at that baby girl and he cried, and I thought that was the moment I knew he was capable of real love. "Marianne." "Don't!" The word came out sharp, and Graham stopped. I turned from the window to face him. My eyes were stinging hot and furious. "Just keep going. There's more in that envelope. Show me the rest." Graham reached in and produced a handwritten letter 2 pages Julian's unmistakable slanted script. He slid it across the desk toward me. I picked it up. Julian's handwriting had deteriorated by 2014, the year he wrote it, already showing the tremor of his illness. But the words were precise, deliberate. He wrote that he had been afraid I would leave, afraid of losing the life we had built. He wrote, "You were never wrong. You were never anything but good. I was the one who needed judging, not you." A sound came out of me that I had not planned. Not a sob exactly, more like the sound a person makes when something hits them somewhere they did not know was unprotected. I pressed my hand flat against the letter and breathed through it one breath, then another. "He knew," I said when I could speak again. "He knew what Claire might do someday." Graham nodded slowly. "That is why he left you something else." He reached back into the envelope and placed the last document on the desk. A trust amendment dated October 2014, notarized and filed with the probate court. A legal protection Julian had built quietly in the last year of his life, like a man trying to repair a wall he had spent decades slowly breaking down. I reached for the trust amendment the way I used to reach for a damaged piece during an appraisal, carefully without rushing, because some things deserve the full weight of your attention before you decide what they are worth. The document was 11 pages. I read every one. Julian had amended his revocable living trust in October 2014, 8 months before he died. The language was precise, and I suspected deliberately, so Graham had almost certainly helped him choose every word. The core provision was this: if any party attempted to obtain legal guardianship over Marianne Whitlock or sought to transfer control of her assets through power of attorney obtained under fraudulent or coercive circumstances, Claire Whitlock Pierce would be automatically disqualified from receiving any benefit under the trust. The assets would pass instead to a separate protective fund administered by Graham Vale as independent trustee. In plain terms, Julian had built a trap, and he had built it specifically for Claire. I set the document down on my lap and looked at Graham across the desk. My chest felt like something had been wrung out of it, but my voice when it came was steady. "He knew," I said. "He knew what she might become." Graham leaned forward, elbows on the desk, fingers laced together. "He was afraid of it. He told me when he handed me that envelope that the worst thing he had ever done was bring Claire into your life without telling you the truth. He said he spent years hoping the secret would die with him." Graham's voice roughened. "He was wrong to hope that, and I think toward the end he knew he was wrong." "He was a coward," I said. The word came out without cruelty, but without softening, either flat and accurate the way you name a thing when sentiment will not change its shape. "He was a coward, and he loved me, and I am not sure those two things cancel each other out." "No," Graham said quietly. "I don't think they do." I pressed my palm against the trust document still in my lap. 39 years. I had kissed that child's forehead when she had nightmares. I had held her hand in the waiting room when she miscarried her first pregnancy. I had sat across from her at this very kind of dinner table, in this very kind of November light, and believed completely without reservation that she was the piece of Julian still living in the world. My eyes burned hot and sudden. I blinked hard against it. I was not going to cry for Claire right now. I was going to save that for later when I was alone and had the luxury of falling apart properly. "Tell me what she's doing," I said. "All of it. Not the legal summary. What she is actually doing." Graham drew a breath that told me he had been waiting for this question and dreading it in equal measure. She's building a case that you are no longer mentally competent to manage your own affairs. A doctor named Nolan Greer, a private physician she introduced you to 3 months ago, if you remember, has signed documentation stating you show signs of progressive cognitive decline. The heat behind my eyes sharpened into something closer to fury. I remember that appointment. I answered every question he asked me. I told him the name of the current Treasury Secretary and recited my medication list from memory. I know. That's what makes Greer's report fraudulent. Graham's jaw tightened. But on paper, it carries his medical license and his signature. That is what she would present to a judge. And Silver Magnolia residence? I asked. I watched his face register the fact that I already knew the name, and I watched him decide not to ask how. She has already paid a holding deposit, he said. A woman named Vivian Cross manages the facility. The room being held for you has restricted phone and internet access, standard procedure for patients classified as requiring a controlled environment. He paused. If Claire obtained emergency guardianship, she could have you admitted within 48 hours. You would have very limited ability to contact anyone outside. The full ugliness of it settled over me then, not as a shock, because I had been assembling the shape of it since he first called my name in the doorway, but as a weight, a specific, suffocating weight. My daughter, the person I had spent nearly 4 decades loving, worrying over defending to people who occasionally suggested she was selfish or careless, had paid a deposit on a room to lock me away in. I stood up. My legs felt steadier than they had any right to. "What do you need from me?" I asked. Graham stood as well, and he crossed to the credenza along the far wall and opened the top drawer. What he placed on the desk next stopped me mid-breath. It was a brooch, silver shaped like a laurel branch, nearly identical to the one Julian gave me in 1987, the one currently pinned to my lapel. "Detective Angela Rowe leads the Financial Exploitation Unit at Charleston PD," Graham said. "She investigates elder fraud and coercive guardianship cases. She sent this through me 2 days ago." He met my eyes. "There is a camera inside it. The state of South Carolina allows audio and video recording when one party to the conversation has given consent. If you wear this tonight, everything said in that room is admissible." I looked at the brooch on the desk. Then I looked at the brooch on my coat. I reached up and unclipped Julian's brooch from my lapel, turned it over once in my fingers, all the years it carried, all the mornings I had put it on, without knowing what else I was carrying, and placed it carefully in the front pocket of my handbag. Then I picked up the silver brooch from the desk and pinned it in its place. "Tell me about the nurse," I said. "You mentioned a woman who reported something. I want to know exactly what she found." Graham pulled his chair around to the side of the desk, rather than sitting across from me the way he did when a conversation stopped being formal and became something else. He refilled my water glass from the pitcher on the credenza without asking, set it close to my hand, and then sat down heavily, like a man who had been carrying something for a long time and was finally allowed to put part of it down. "Her name is Lila Monroe," he said. "She works as a medical assistant at Seaview Family Practice, the clinic on Rutledge Avenue, about 6 blocks from your house. You've been going there for your annual checkups for the past 4 years." I nodded. I knew the clinic. Small waiting room, good natural light. A receptionist named Deborah, who always remembered that I took my tea without sugar. "Lila has been there about 2 years," Graham continued. "She's thorough, the kind of person who notices when something doesn't add up. About 3 weeks ago, she started noticing Claire." "Noticing her how?" I asked, leaning forward slightly. "Claire had been coming into the clinic periodically asking for nutritional guidance. She said it was for you. Supplements, hydration, that kind of thing." Graham's expression tightened. "But the requests didn't match your file. Your records show no deficiencies that would require the kind of supplementation Claire was asking about. Specifically, she was asking about high-concentration valerian extract combined with magnesium in an electrolyte drink formulation." I felt the words land somewhere cold in the center of my chest. "The pear-flavored water," I said. "Yes." Graham's voice was careful, steady, the way a person speaks when they are delivering information they know is going to hurt. "Valerian is an herbal compound. It's sold over the counter, completely legal to purchase. In normal doses, it promotes mild relaxation and sleep. but at the concentrations Claire was asking about taken daily over several weeks by someone your age, the effects compound. Prolonged confusion, unusual fatigue, slowed speech, difficulty retaining short-term information. My stomach turned. My hands curled tight in my lap, knuckles pressing white against each other. Every evening for weeks, Claire had stood in my kitchen with that soft, attentive expression and said, "Drink this, Mom. I just want you to sleep well." And I had believed her. I had drunk it and thanked her, and felt grateful that she worried about me. "She made me look like I was losing my mind," I said. My voice came out low and scorched like something burning at the edges. "She gave me that water and then filmed me when I couldn't hold a thought together." "That appears to be what happened," Graham said, and the grief in his voice was real. He was not reading from a file. He was telling me about a betrayal he had watched take shape and had not been able to stop fast enough. "How did Lila connect this to you?" I pressed. "She didn't come to me directly," Graham said. "She went first to the supervising physician at the clinic, not Greer, a different doctor, and raised her concerns. The doctor told her there was no formal complaint she could file without more evidence, and suggested she document what she had observed, but Lila wasn't satisfied with that." A faint note of respect entered his voice. "She asked around quietly and found out that I had been Julian's attorney. She called my office 10 days ago through a mutual acquaintance, a woman in her church, who had done paralegal work for me years back. She told me everything she had seen and heard." I exhaled slowly. 10 days. Graham had known for 10 days, and he had used those days to gather to verify to make sure he was not handing me a story that would fall apart the moment I pushed on it. "There's something else Lila told me," Graham said, and the shift in his tone made me straighten in my chair. "About 2 weeks ago, she overheard Claire in the clinic hallway speaking on the phone. Lila only caught part of the conversation, but what she heard was this. Claire said, 'She fell asleep in the chair again. We need another few weeks of footage.'" The burning behind my eyes returned fiercer this time. I blinked hard and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of my nose. Footage. My own daughter. The words still came, automatically. Still carried 39 years of weight, had been treating my kitchen like a film set and treating my confusion like a prop. "When did Claire find out the truth?" I asked. "About the DNA, about who she really is." Graham laced his fingers together on the desk. "We believe approximately 8 months ago. When she arranged to have Julian's home safe rekeyed after the lock mechanism failed, the technician had to empty and catalog the contents. The original DNA report was inside. Claire signed the inventory form herself. 8 months. She had known for 8 months. She had sat across from me at Easter dinner, helped me plant the summer garden, called me on my birthday, and sung to me over the phone, all while knowing. "And Mara Voss," I asked, my voice tightening around the name, "when did she reappear?" "Shortly after Claire found the file," Graham said. "We don't know exactly how they made contact, whether Mara sought Claire out or the other way around. What we do know is that Mara is now operating under the name Mara Bell and presenting herself as a senior care consultant." His jaw set hard. "She has been meeting Claire regularly. A taxi driver named Oscar Dane had dashcam footage showing them together at a motel on the coast on multiple occasions over the past 3 months. Oscar had recognized Claire from a prior affair and flagged the recordings manually each time he had been keeping them on a separate hard drive after the 3rd occasion when the pattern struck him as unusual enough to preserve." I felt a bitter, hollow sound rise in my throat, not quite a laugh, not quite a cry. Mara Voss had waited 39 years. She had watched from whatever distance she kept herself at, and then the moment the door cracked open, she had walked straight through it and handed my daughter a reason to hate me. "What did she tell Claire?" I asked, even though part of me already felt the answer like a bruise. Graham met my eyes directly because he was at his core, a man who believed in not softening the truth once you had decided to tell it. "She told Claire that you had stolen the life that should have belonged to them." The words hit like a closed fist. My breath left me in one short, sharp exhale. I gripped the armrest of the chair, steadied myself, and stared at a fixed point on the far wall until the room stopped tilting. "All right," I said, finally, my voice rough but functional. "Then let's talk about tonight." Graham refilled his own coffee cup, cold by now, but he drank it anyway, the way men do when they need something to hold while they talk about difficult things. He set the cup down and spread both hands flat on the desk, like a man laying out the bones of something he needed me to see all at once. "I want you to understand the full structure of what they've built," he said. "Not just the pieces, the whole architecture." "Then show it to me," I said. My voice had steadied itself somewhere between Mara's name and this moment. I had worked 40 years reading damage water beneath veneer hairline fractures in ceramic, the way a forged brushstroke betrays itself in the wrong kind of light. I could look at ugly things clearly. That was perhaps the most useful skill I had ever developed. "Your assets are titled solely in your name," Graham began. "The Battery Row property, the investment accounts, the family art collection, the trust principal. None of it passed automatically to Claire at Julian's death, because Julian structured everything through the revocable trust with you as sole current beneficiary. Claire cannot touch a single dollar of it without your signature or a court order." "Which is why they need the guardianship," I said. "Exactly." Graham leaned forward. "Under South Carolina law, if a petitioner can demonstrate to a probate court that an individual lacks the mental capacity to manage their own affairs, the court can appoint a guardian with full authority over that person's finances and living arrangements. The standard of proof is a preponderance of evidence, meaning it only needs to be more likely than not. With a signed physician's report, video documentation of apparent cognitive episodes, and family testimony, Claire's attorney could file an emergency petition and potentially get a temporary order within days. The clinical precision of it turned my stomach. "She wasn't trying to steal from me," I said, and the bitterness in my own voice surprised me with its sharpness. "She was trying to make a court believe I was too far gone to know I was being stolen from." "That is the most accurate description I've heard," Graham said, and there was a grimness in his voice that told me he had been turning those same words over for days. "Where does Evan fit into this?" I asked. "He has always struck me as too disorganized to plan something this deliberate." Graham's expression shifted something between professional restraint and frank contempt. "Evan Pierce is the reason the timeline accelerated. On his own, he is exactly as disorganized as you think, but he is also desperate." Graham pulled a single printed page from the folder on his desk and turned it toward me. "Detective Rowe's unit developed this as part of their financial exploitation investigation. Evan has accumulated approximately $780,000 in losses, a combination of failed cryptocurrency investments and cash borrowed from a private lender named Reed Calder." I stared at the number, $780,000. The sum was so large it briefly failed to feel real, the way very large losses sometimes don't, until you connect them to something concrete, a house, a year of work, a life. "Reed Calder is not a bank," Graham continued. "He operates outside licensed lending, what most people would call a loan shark. He gave Evan a final deadline of 10 days to produce a substantial payment or face consequences that Detective Rowe's unit is currently documenting separately." Graham paused. "That deadline falls in 9 days from tonight." 9 days. The number dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and I felt the ripples of it move through everything I had heard in the past 2 hours. The evening, the dinner, the carefully prepared glass of pear electrolyte water. It was not simply malice, it was a deadline wearing the costume of a family gathering. So tonight was never about the anniversary. I said, my throat tight with a fury I was working hard to keep behind my back teeth. It was about Evan's debt collector. Tonight was about closing the final pieces of the case file they need for the guardianship petition, Graham said. If they could get footage of you appearing disoriented at a family dinner in front of witnesses in a setting that looked ordinary and warm, combined with Greer's report and whatever Nina found at the bank. I stopped him. "Nina, you mentioned that name on the phone. Who is she?" "Nina Brooks," Graham said. "She's a senior accounts officer at Coastal Heritage Bank, where 2 of your investment accounts are held. 3 weeks ago, she flagged an anomaly in a transfer authorization form that had been submitted allegedly with your signature to restructure account ownership. The signature didn't match your file specimens. The pen pressure was inconsistent, and 1 letter formation in your first name was wrong in a way that suggested it was copied rather than written from muscle memory. My hand moved involuntarily to my collarbone fingertips, brushing the edge of the silver brooch. Someone had practiced my signature. Someone had sat somewhere at a kitchen table, perhaps with a piece of paper and a pen, and practiced writing my name until it was almost right. Almost. She reported it, I asked, and my voice cracked on the last word despite everything I was doing to hold it level. She flagged it internally and put a hold on the form, Graham said, which is why they needed tonight. The bank route failed. The footage route required more time. Tonight was meant to be the moment that changed everything, one dramatic incident at a family dinner, witnessed by everyone present, that would give Claire's attorney the final piece to file. I stood up from the chair, not because I had somewhere to go, but because my body needed to be vertical. I walked to the window. Outside, Broad Street was fully dark now, the streetlights throwing pale gold circles on the pavement below. Somewhere across the city, in a house full of warm lights and carefully arranged flowers, my daughter was waiting for me to walk through her door. My eyes stung. I pressed my thumb hard against the corner of one eye, refusing. Not yet. Not here. There's something else, Graham said behind me, and the particular quietness of his voice made me turn back. He was looking at his phone. Lila sent a message 4 minutes ago. He read aloud. Claire stopped by the clinic at 5:45. She picked up another bottle of the pear electrolyte. She said it was for the dinner tonight. The room felt very still. Then Graham's phone buzzed again, and this time neither of us needed to say anything at all. We both knew what the next step was. Graham answered on the first buzz. He put the call on speaker without asking whether I wanted him to, which told me he had already decided I needed to hear this directly, not filtered through his summary afterward. Lila. His voice was measured. I have Marianne with me. You're on speaker. Tell her what you told me. A brief pause, the sound of someone gathering themselves on the other end of the line. Then a woman's voice came through, clear and unhurried, with the particular steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this moment, but was still feeling the weight of it. Mrs. Whitlock. The voice was younger than I had imagined, mid-30s maybe, with a slight coastal Carolina accent, softened by years of professional training. I want you to know that I debated a long time before I made that first call to Mr. Vale. I kept asking myself if I was overreacting. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place. But you called anyway, I said. My throat was tight, but I kept my voice even. I am very glad you did. I heard her exhale a long, relieved breath, as if she had been holding that particular lungful since the moment she dialed. 3 weeks ago, she began, your daughter came into the clinic asking about supplement protocols for elderly patients with sleep disruption. She said she was worried about you. She described symptoms, forgetting where she put things, nodding off unexpectedly slower response time in conversation. Lila paused. The thing is, Mrs. Whitlock, none of those symptoms were in your file. I've pulled your records. Your last 2 annual exams showed excellent cognitive scores. Your physician noted you were sharp engaged and asked detailed questions about your own health management. Something hot moved behind my eyes. She was describing the person she was creating, I said, and the words tasted like ash in my mouth. Not the person I was. That's exactly what I came to believe, Lila said, and her voice hardened with a quiet professional anger that I found unexpectedly comforting. When I looked at what she was requesting, valerian extract, at a concentration well above the standard sleep aid dosage, combined with magnesium and passion flower in a liquid electrolyte base, I flagged it with Dr. Holloway, the physician I assist. He told me there was no formal complaint mechanism without documented harm and suggested I keep notes. Her tone tightened. I kept notes. I also kept copies of the request forms Claire submitted. Lila, Graham said carefully, tell Marianne what you overheard in the hallway. Another pause, shorter this time. About 2 weeks ago, Claire was in the waiting room and stepped into the hallway to take a phone call. I was coming out of the supply room. She didn't see me. She had her back to me, so I only caught part of it. Lila's voice dropped slightly, as though even recounting it made her uncomfortable. She said, and I'm giving you her exact words as best I can remember, she fell asleep in the chair again. We need another few weeks of footage before we file. The word footage detonated somewhere in the middle of my chest. I gripped the back of the chair in front of me, both hands wrapped around the wood knuckles, aching with the pressure of it. I had nodded off in my armchair watching the evening news. I had misplaced my reading glasses on the bathroom shelf. I had once on a night I now understood very differently, woken up on the sofa with no memory of sitting down. Every one of those moments had felt like age, like the ordinary indignity of a body slowing down. Every one of those moments had been recorded. "She filmed me," I said. My voice broke on the last word just slightly, just enough that I hated myself for it. I pressed my free hand flat against my sternum as if I could hold whatever was cracking in there together by force. She stood in my living room and filmed me while I was at my most vulnerable, and she called it evidence. "Mrs. Whitlock." Lila's voice came through the speaker with a gentleness that caught me off guard. "I want you to hear me say this clearly. What I observed, what I documented, what I copied and gave to Mr. Vale, I did it because what was being done to you is wrong. Full stop. You deserve to have someone in your corner who had no stake in the outcome." I pressed my fingers hard against my lips. My eyes were burning, brimming, furious. I was not going to weep on the phone with a woman I had never met, even if she had just said the most decent thing anyone had said to me in the past 2 hours. "Thank you, Lila," I managed. "I mean that." "There's one more thing," Graham said, and his tone told me this was not a small addition. "Tell her about tonight." "I was at the clinic until 6, Lila said. "Claire came in at 5:45. She said she needed to pick up the supplement order she had placed earlier in the week. She took 1 full bottle of the pear electrolyte blend. A beat. She was dressed for an evening out, hair done, good coat. She was in a hurry." Graham ended the call and set the phone face down on the desk. He looked at me across the room, and for a moment neither of us spoke, not from the stillness of shock, but from the purposeful quiet of 2 people who had heard enough and were deciding what came next. "She is going to put that bottle on the table in front of me tonight," I said, my voice stripped clean of everything except clarity. "And she is going to have a camera ready for what she thinks will happen 20 minutes after I drink it." "Yes," Graham said. I straightened my spine. I adjusted the silver brooch on my lapel. The camera inside it was no larger than a coat button, but in that moment, it felt like the most significant thing I was wearing. "Then I need to be there," I said, "and I need to be the last thing she expects." Graham reached into his desk drawer one final time and produced a plain white card, Angela Rowe's direct number handwritten in blue ink. He pressed it into my palm, folded my fingers over it, and held my hand for just a moment. "2 blocks away," he said. "The whole time." I put the card in my coat pocket, picked up my handbag, and walked out the door. The night had settled fully over Charleston by the time I pulled out of the parking garage on Broad Street, 6:35 by the clock on the dashboard. The streetlights laid their pale gold reflections across the wet pavement. It must have drizzled while I was upstairs, though I had not heard it, and the city wore that particular November look it gets after dark, quiet, and a little hollowed out like a house where everyone has moved to the back rooms. I turned onto Laguerre Street and headed toward Harleston Village. 15 minutes. That was all I had. I did not turn on the radio. I did not call anyone. I simply drove, and I let the memories come because they were going to come regardless. And I had learned long ago that the only way through certain kinds of pain was straight through the center of it. Claire at 5 years old, standing on the back porch in her nightgown, both hands outstretched in the rain, laughing so hard she could barely breathe. I had stood at the kitchen door watching her, and felt something so complete and uncomplicated that I had thought I remember thinking this exactly, that this was what people meant when they said their heart was full, not a metaphor, a physical fact. Claire at 12, coming home from school with a split lip because a girl in her class had said something cruel about her hair. She had not cried in front of her classmates. She had waited until she was in our kitchen sitting on the counter while I pressed a cold cloth to her mouth, and then she had cried so hard her whole body shook. I had held her and said, "You are allowed to fall apart here. This kitchen is a safe place." She had nodded against my shoulder and said, "I know, Mama. I always know." "I know, Mama. I always know." My hands tightened on the steering wheel until the knuckles ached. My eyes burned so ferociously I had to blink 3 times in quick succession to keep the road in focus. I was not going to cry while driving. I was absolutely not going to cry while driving. I made myself breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way the doctor had taught me years ago when Julian's illness was at its worst, and I had needed something mechanical to hold on to. The memories kept coming. Not the painful ones now, the ordinary ones, which were somehow worse. Claire at 30 calling me on a Tuesday afternoon for no reason except that she had been thinking about the summer we spent in Beaufort when she was 16 and wanted to know if I remembered the name of the ice cream place on Bay Street. I remembered. She laughed. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing important at all. 40 minutes of a Tuesday afternoon that I would give a great deal to have back right now. 8 months. She had known for 8 months and she had still called me on ordinary Tuesdays. I stopped at a red light on the corner of Rutledge and Cannon. The clinic where Lila worked was 2 blocks north of here. I looked in that direction without meaning to, as though I might see some trace of the thing that had been set in motion in that building. The quiet, careful documentation of my own unraveling, assembled bottle by bottle, night by night, in the name of a love I had never once questioned. Then something else surfaced. A memory I had filed away as unremarkable at the time. 3 weeks ago, I had been sitting in my armchair after dinner, and Claire had brought me a cup of passion flower tea along with the pear electrolyte water, setting both on the side table with that attentive, unhurried gentleness she had been showing me all autumn. I had drunk both because she had asked me to, and because I trusted her. And somewhere in the middle of the 10 o'clock news, I had simply ceased to be aware of anything at all. I woke up at 2 a.m. with a stiff neck and a cottony, disconnected feeling in my head, and my phone was not on the side table where I always left it. I found it the next morning in the refrigerator, tucked beside the orange juice, and I had laughed at myself. Told Claire about it when she called. She had made a soft, sympathetic sound and said, "Oh, Mom, we really need to keep an eye on things." I had felt embarrassed. I had felt grateful that she was watching out for me. The light turned green. I pressed the accelerator and moved through the intersection, and the rage that moved through me in that moment was so clean and so cold, it was almost clarifying, like stepping into cold water and feeling every nerve ending announce itself at once. She had watched me find my phone in the refrigerator. She had heard me laugh at my own confusion, and she had filed it away as footage. The second memory arrived right behind the first, and this one stopped my breath entirely for a moment. 2 weeks ago from my garden. I had been deadheading the roses along the south wall and had glanced toward Claire's house 2 streets over. We lived close enough that from my second-floor window I could see the roofline, but from the garden the angle was different, and what I saw that afternoon was the front of her house from the street. A taxi had been idling at the curb. I had noticed it because it sat there longer than taxis usually did, 5 minutes, maybe more. And when the front door of Claire's house finally opened, a woman walked out. Tall, dark-haired, wearing a gray coat, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had just concluded a satisfactory meeting. She got into the taxi, and it pulled away. I had thought nothing of it at the time. A friend of Claire's, perhaps. A colleague. Now I thought that was Mara Voss. That was the woman who had spent 39 years deciding that I had taken something that belonged to her, and she had been standing inside my daughter's house 2 weeks ago, planning the rest of it over whatever they were drinking in Claire's kitchen. I turned onto Claire's street. The house was a head-warm light in every window, the soft glow of the greenhouse visible around the side fairy lights strung along the garden fence. It looked exactly like what Claire had called it, a family gathering, a warm house on a cold November night. I pulled to the curb and sat for a moment with the engine running. I touched the brooch on my lapel, not Julian's brooch, not anymore, but the one that mattered tonight. Then I turned off the ignition, stepped out into the cold air, and walked up the gravel path to the front door. I knocked twice. The door opened almost immediately, as though she had been watching for me. "Mom." Claire's face opened into a wide, warm smile, her arms coming up in welcome, her voice carrying that particular note of relief and affection she had always used when I arrived somewhere. I was starting to worry. "Come in, everyone's already here." I smiled back at her. 70 years had taught me many things, and one of them was how to make a smile reach your eyes when your chest felt like broken glass. "I wouldn't miss it," I said, and stepped inside. The greenhouse smelled of warm earth and cut flowers, and the faint sweetness of candle wax, the kind of smell that under any other circumstance would have made me feel genuinely welcome. Claire had strung fairy lights along the iron frame overhead, and they threw a soft, trembling light across the long table, across the white linen and the good china and the crystal glasses that caught every flicker and multiplied it. It was beautiful. She had made it beautiful, and that detail hurt in a way I had not fully anticipated. I took it all in the way I had always taken in a room, systematically starting at the edges and working inward. Evan Pierce sat at the far end of the table, his chair angled slightly away from the others, as though he had not quite committed to being fully present. I had known Evan for 11 years, long enough to know that he was the kind of man who filled a room with noise when he was comfortable and retreated into his own collar when he was not. Tonight, he was very much in his collar. His tie was loosened, his eyes carried the particular dull redness of someone who had been drinking since mid-afternoon, and his right hand was wrapped around a nearly empty glass of bourbon with the grip of a man holding a life preserver. Even as Claire led me to my seat, I watched Evan's gaze slide to his watch. 7:08. He clocked it like a deadline. Beside me, a small voice said, "Grandma." I turned, and the tightness in my chest released by exactly one notch. Sophie Pierce was 19 years old, and she had her mother's dark hair, but mercifully her own eyes wide and brown and direct, in the way that some people's eyes stay honest long after the world has given them every reason not to be. She was sitting in the chair next to mine, with a small notebook open in front of her, a pen turning slowly between her fingers, watching the room the way a person watches when they are recording it in their memory rather than simply passing through it. "Hello, my darling." I kissed the top of her head and felt her lean into it warm and trusting the way she always did. "What are you drawing?" "A house," she said without looking up. "And you, and me." My throat tightened. I sat down, smoothed my napkin across my lap, and kept my expression exactly as pleasant as the occasion required. That was when Claire steered a woman toward the empty chair at the end of the table and said in the practiced tone of someone making a comfortable introduction, "Mom, I want you to meet Mara Bell. She's been an incredible resource for our family. She specializes in senior care planning, and she's been helping us think through some options for the future." The woman extended her hand. "Mrs. Whitlock, it's wonderful to finally meet you." I shook it. Her grip was firm and professional, her smile measured and warm in exactly the calibrated way of someone who smiled at strangers for a living. She was perhaps 65, with silver-streaked dark hair cut close and sharp, and cheekbones that belonged on a woman who had once been striking, and knew it. Her eyes, when they met mine, held something that was not quite friendliness and not quite appraisal. It lived precisely between those two things, and it told me she was very good at her work. I had seen her face before, not in person, in a photograph, black and white, slightly overexposed, taken sometime in the mid-1980s. A younger version of this same bone structure, this same set of the jaw. Mara Voss. In my daughter's dining room, wearing a different name like a coat she had borrowed for the evening. I felt the recognition move through me like ice water through a pipe, swift, cold, and contained entirely within my own skin. Nothing in my face changed. Nothing in my posture shifted. 40 years of professional appraisal work had given me the ability to look at a thing and show nothing until I had decided what to do about it. "It's lovely to meet you, too," I said pleasantly. "Claire speaks very highly of you." We took our seats. The food was good. Claire had always been an accomplished cook. That particular skill she had learned at my elbow on Sunday afternoons when she was 12, and I was teaching her that patience was the difference between a sauce that worked and one that didn't. I ate, and I listened, and I watched. Evan looked at his watch again, 7:12. His knuckles tightened around his bourbon glass, and he tipped it back for the last half inch. He was running calculations behind his eyes. I could see it, the way you can see weather moving across an open sky, the slight tension at the corners of his mouth, the way his gaze kept skipping from Claire to the bottle of pear electrolyte water sitting on the serving table against the wall. That bottle. Pale yellow moisture beading on the outside, positioned with the careful casualness of something placed by someone who knew exactly where it was. Sophie tugged my sleeve. I looked down. She turned the notebook toward me. On the open page, she had written in her small, precise handwriting a single line, "You are the sharpest person at this table tonight. Don't let them tell you otherwise." And beneath it, S. Something cracked open behind my sternum, quiet and devastating. I took the drawing from her hands very carefully, as though it were something that might not survive rough handling, and folded it once and placed it in the pocket of my blazer close against my ribs. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, and my voice only wavered on the last syllable only barely. She gave me a smile that was small and warm and entirely genuine, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who has not yet learned to use smiling as a strategy, and turned back to her notebook. Claire appeared at my shoulder, a tall glass in her hand, the familiar pale gold of para-electrolyte catching the fairy lights. She set it down at my right hand with the smooth efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the gesture. "You haven't touched your water, Mom," she said warmly, rubbing my shoulder once. "Drink up. You know how you forget when you're talking." I looked at the glass. I looked at Claire's hand on my shoulder. I looked at Evan across the table, whose eyes had moved from his watch to the glass in front of me with an attention so concentrated it was almost audible. I picked up the glass, brought it to my lips, and set it down again without drinking, turning it slightly so the condensation left a small wet ring on the linen. "I will," I said, smiling up at her. "Just let me get through the appetizers first." Claire's hand left my shoulder. As she turned away, I used the folded edge of my dinner napkin to slide the glass 2 inches to the right near the edge of the table away from my plate, and kept my palm resting lightly over the napkin so the fabric preserved what was on the outside of that glass without disturbing it. Nobody noticed. That was the thing about being 70 and female and underestimated. Nobody ever noticed. The main course arrived: roasted chicken with herbs from Claire's garden, the kind of meal she made when she wanted to signal effort and warmth. She had always known how to use food as language. I had taught her that too, along with the patience for sauces, along with the Sunday afternoons, and the good knives and everything else I had poured into the making of her. I picked up my fork and directed my attention across the table. "Mara," I said in the pleasantly curious tone I had used for decades when meeting new people at gallery openings and appraisal conferences, "how long have you been doing senior care consulting? It seems like such meaningful work." Mara looked up from her plate. Her smile came easily, too easily, the practiced warmth of someone who had learned to deploy it on cue. "About 12 years now," she said. "I started after my own mother needed care, and I realized how few families understand their options. It became a calling, I suppose." 12 years, I repeated, nodding as though this were genuinely interesting. "And where were you based before Charleston? You don't sound like a local." Something moved behind her eyes, just a fraction, just the smallest recalibration, like a compass needle swinging to correct itself. "I've moved around quite a bit," she said smoothly. "Virginia, Georgia, a few years in Florida. I settled here about 2 years ago." "How wonderful," I said. "Charleston has a way of keeping people, doesn't it?" I cut a piece of chicken and ate it and did not look at her, because I had learned 30 years ago that people reveal more when they do not feel watched. From the corner of my eye, I saw Mara pick up her wineglass and take a longer sip than the conversation warranted. A small tell. Noted. Claire was saying something to Evan at the other end of the table, her voice low, her posture angled away from me in the way people angle when they think they have achieved privacy in a public space. Evan responded in a murmur, his jaw tight, his eyes cutting to his watch for the 3rd time since I had sat down. 7:22. He was counting something. Minutes, probably. "Claire was telling us," Mara said, turning back to me with the careful warmth of someone steering a conversation toward pre-planned territory, "that you've been having some difficult stretches lately, forgetting appointments, that kind of thing. It must be unsettling." I looked at her pleasantly. "Has she?" I must say I find my memory quite reliable. I remembered every item on my grocery list this morning without writing it down, which I've always considered a reasonable benchmark. Mara laughed, polished, appropriate, exactly the right length. "Well, of course. We all have good days and harder ones. That's why planning ahead is so important." "Absolutely," I agreed. I've always believed in planning ahead. Across the table, Claire had shifted her attention back to the broader conversation and was saying to no one in particular, "Even our neighbor has noticed, hasn't she, Mom, Ruth Bellamy? She mentioned to me just last week that she'd seen you in the garden at midnight. She was worried." My fork paused above my plate for precisely 1/2 second before I continued eating. Ruth Bellamy, my neighbor of 20 years who brought coffee over the fence and waved through the kitchen window. I had not been in my garden at midnight, not once, not ever, not in 11 years of living alone on Battery Row. My garden gate had a latch that stuck and squealed like a wounded animal when you pushed it, and I would sooner have heard myself do it than Ruth would have. Claire had just invented a witness. At her own dinner table in front of guests, she had manufactured a detail about a real person who had not said any such thing. I kept my expression exactly as it had been, mildly attentive, pleasantly engaged, and said, "Ruth is very thoughtful. She's always looked out for me." It was not agreement. It was not denial. It was a wall of perfect pleasantness that gave Claire nothing to work with. Sophie chose that moment to push her chair back and hop down, reaching across for the napkin holder at the center of the table. She was too short to reach it easily, so she came around to my side and stretched past me, and as she did, she turned her head and put her lips very close to my ear. "Grandma!" Her voice was barely a breath, the kind of sound a child makes when they understand on some instinctive level that this particular message requires secrecy. "You remember everything. You remembered Miss Henderson's birthday last month, and you remembered my recital was on a Thursday, even when Mom forgot. How come she keeps saying you don't remember things?" My chest cracked open like something under pressure that had finally found a seam. I reached up and covered Sophie's small hand with mine for exactly 1 second, warm, brief, a whole conversation in a single touch, and murmured, "Thank you, sweetheart. Go sit back down now." She scooted back to her chair, clutching her napkin with the triumphant air of a child who had completed an important errand. She had no idea what she had just given me. I did not know yet what Sophie was doing upstairs, whether she was simply sitting with her hurt feelings, or whether that quiet, watchful mind of hers was doing something more. What I knew was that her words had confirmed every single thing I needed to feel certain about what I was doing tonight. I looked back at Mara, who had been watching the exchange with an expression she had not quite managed to keep neutral. "She's a remarkable child," I said simply. "She is," Mara said, and her voice had shifted by a half-tone just enough that someone paying close attention would catch it. Less warmth, more assessment. "Tell me, Mara," I said, setting down my fork and looking at her with the direct, unhurried gaze I had used when examining disputed pieces. "In your 12 years of consulting, how often do you find that families accurately assess the people they're making decisions for?" She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said pleasantly, "that the people who love us are not always the most reliable observers of who we actually are. They see what they expect to see, what they need to see." I picked up my water glass, my own, the plain one I had poured myself, and took a calm sip. In my experience, the most accurate assessments come from people with no stake in the outcome. Mara held my gaze, and for the first time tonight I saw something real pass across her face, not the consultant's warmth, not the rehearsed smile. Something older and harder and considerably less composed. Before she could respond, Claire rose from her chair at the head of the table and tapped the rim of her wine glass with her knife. The clear, thin ring of crystal on silver cut through the table noise like a signal. "I'd like to say a few words," Claire announced, her voice carrying the careful brightness of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times. "About family, and about the future." Her hand, wrapped around the stem of her wine glass, had knuckles that were pressed white with the effort of holding on. Claire had the voice for this kind of speech. She always had warm, unhurried, carrying just enough emotion to feel genuine without tipping into performance. I had watched her use it at Julian's funeral, at Sophie's school fundraisers, at the neighborhood association meetings, where she somehow made zoning ordinances sound like matters of personal principle. It was a gift, that voice. I had once been proud of it. "I want to start by saying how much it means to have everyone here tonight." She began, her gaze moving around the table with the practiced inclusiveness of someone who had rehearsed the eye contact as carefully as the words. "Family is the most important thing any of us have, and sometimes loving someone means making hard decisions on their behalf, decisions they might not fully understand in the moment, but that come from a place of pure care." Pure care. The phrase settled over the table like a fine net, invisible and complete. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my expression open and attentive, and watched Evan from the corner of my eye. His right hand had moved from his bourbon glass to the edge of the table, fingers drumming a slow, irregular rhythm against the linen. 7:41. He had looked at his watch twice in the past 4 minutes. Whatever arithmetic he was running in his head, the numbers were not improving. Over the past several months, Claire continued, her voice softening further into something that resembled tenderness, our family has been noticing some changes, small things at first, forgetting where things were placed, moments of confusion that passed quickly but left us worried. She paused and pressed one hand briefly to her sternum, the gesture of a woman bearing a weight she had carried privately for too long. We love Mom too much to ignore those signs. Every word was a brick laid with architectural precision. I recognized the structure because I had spent 4 decades identifying structures the way a thing was built, told you everything about what it was meant to hold. That's why I asked Mara to join us tonight, Claire said, extending one hand toward Mara in a gesture of gracious inclusion. She's helped so many families navigate this exact kind of situation, and she has some thoughts about next steps that I think will give us all peace of mind. Mara reached into the leather folio on the chair beside her and produced a thin stack of papers clipped together at the corner. She set them on the table with the calm efficiency of someone performing a routine professional task. I could read the header from where I sat. Cognitive Assessment, Whitlock, Marianne, September 2025. Dr. N. Greer. The document that did not exist in any legitimate medical file. The assessment conducted according to its own date on a day I had spent 4 hours at a bed and breakfast in Savannah celebrating a friend's retirement. A hot wire of fury ran from my jaw straight down to my stomach. I breathed through it carefully, the way you breathe through physical pain, not to make it disappear, but to keep it from making your decisions for you. I'd like to say something, I said. Claire's eyes came to me immediately, and in that fraction of a second before she arranged her expression into attentiveness, I saw at the flicker. Not guilt. Something colder than guilt. Calculation. Of course, Mom, she said warmly. This is about you. We want to hear from you. That assessment. I nodded toward the papers in front of Mara. Dr. Greer conducted it on the 12th of September according to that header. I was in Savannah that day. I have a reservation confirmation, a receipt from the restaurant where 6 of us had lunch, and a photograph taken on the Battery wall at Forsyth Park at 2 in the afternoon. I kept my voice mild, almost conversational, the way I used to present discrepancies to insurance clients who had submitted questionable claims. I'm happy to provide any of those if they would be useful. The table held its breath. Even the fairy lights overhead seemed to dim slightly, though of course they did not. Claire recovered faster than I had expected. I gave her credit for that. Mom, I think there may have been some scheduling confusion. Dr. Greer saw you twice. Remember the first visit in August. The first visit in August, I said pleasantly, was a general wellness consultation at which I correctly identified the current U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, named all 7 of my prescription medications in the correct dosages, and described in detail the provenance of 3 pieces in my art collection. If Dr. Greer's notes from that visit suggest otherwise, I would be very interested in reading them. Evan pushed back from the table abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the stone floor, a sound like something tearing. Look, he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended, thickened by bourbon and barely contained desperation. We don't need to make this into a whole thing. The whole point is just to get some things organized. Financially, medically, all of it. It's simple. Simple for whom, Evan? I asked, and I looked directly at him for the first time tonight, holding his gaze with the steady patience of a woman who had nothing to hide and all evening to wait. Simple for you. His jaw tightened. His fingers found his watch strap and gripped it, not to check the time, just to hold something. The skin around his eyes was tight and slightly gray, the specific colorlessness of a man living inside a deadline he could not outrun. Claire mentioned restructuring the financial arrangements, I said, returning my gaze to my daughter. Protective measures, I believe the phrase was earlier this week when we spoke. I tilted my head slightly. Is that connected to Silver Magnolia Residence by any chance, the center on James Island? Claire's lips parted. A half-second passed. We've only been exploring options, Mom. Nothing is decided. Of course, I said. And then because I wanted her to hear the precision of it, have you already placed a deposit? No, she said. It was a single syllable delivered without hesitation, smooth as river stone. And it was a lie so complete and so practiced that it hit me differently than her other lies had not, with rage, but with a profound, settling sadness that dropped through me like a stone through still water, all the way to the bottom. She had looked me in the eye and said no. I nodded once, as though satisfied, and picked up my fork. Beside me, Sophie had stopped drawing. She was watching her mother, with an expression I recognized not confusion, but the careful cataloging attention of a child who was adding something to a list she had been keeping for some time. Then Mara cleared her throat and opened the assessment document to the second page, and what she began reading aloud was clinical and measured and built entirely on nothing. Mara read in the measured cadence of someone who had learned that clinical language delivered slowly carried more authority than passion ever could. Progressive episodic memory disruption, diminished executive function, observable lapses in temporal orientation. Each phrase landed on the table like something heavy being set down one after another, building a portrait of a woman I did not recognize and had never been. I listened to every word. I had to, because the only way to dismantle something was to understand exactly how it had been assembled. On the occasion of the September assessment, Mara continued running one manicured finger along the third paragraph. The subject demonstrated difficulty recalling the current date and showed marked hesitation when asked to perform sequential tasks. I set my fork down with a quiet precision that drew nobody's attention, except I noticed Sophie's. "What sequential tasks?" I asked. Mara looked up. "I beg your pardon?" "The assessment mentioned sequential tasks," I said pleasantly. "I'm curious what they were. In my experience with cognitive evaluations, and I've reviewed enough insurance claims involving contested mental capacity to have some familiarity, the specific tasks matter enormously. Asking someone to count backward from 100 by sevens is a very different measure than asking them to sort objects by color." A muscle in Mara's jaw tightened. She glanced at Claire, a quick sideways cut of the eyes that she almost managed to disguise as a natural head movement. "The details of the methodology are outlined in the supplementary notes," she said smoothly. "Wonderful," I said. "I'd love to see those." Claire stepped in before Mara could respond, her voice pressing down the tension with the practiced firmness of a woman who had been managing conversations since she was a teenager. "Mom, I really think we can go through the specifics another time. Tonight is about the bigger picture." "The bigger picture being what exactly?" I asked. I kept my tone curious, unhurried, the tone of a woman who had all the time in the world and genuinely wanted to understand. "Being taken care of," Claire said, and for just a moment, just a flash, something raw crossed her face. Not love, not guilt, but the particular anguish of a person who has been carrying two contradictory things for so long that they no longer know which one is real. Then it was gone, covered over with the warm, careful expression she had been wearing all evening. From the corner of my eye, I saw Evan's hand move, not toward his watch this time, toward Claire, a small gesture barely perceptible, 2 fingers pressed briefly against the back of her wrist. She did not look at him, but the line of her shoulders shifted just slightly, as though she had received a message through the skin. I saw it. I catalogued it. I said nothing. Then Evan leaned forward, both forearms on the table, and looked at me with the blunt directness of a man who had run out of patience for subtlety. "Marianne, what we're talking about here is making sure things are in order, legally, financially. Claire has power of attorney prepared. It's a standard document. It just means she can act on your behalf if—" "Evan?" My voice was quiet, but it stopped him the way a closed door stops a person mid-stride. "A durable power of attorney is not a standard document in the way you're describing it. In South Carolina, it grants the holder the legal authority to make financial and medical decisions on behalf of another person. It is not something signed casually over dinner." I held his gaze with the steadiness of a woman who had read every word of Julian's trust amendment that afternoon and understood precisely what was at stake. "I would want my own attorney present for any such conversation, which I'm sure you understand." Evan's mouth opened, closed. His fingers found the edge of the table and pressed against it, and the color that rose up his neck was not embarrassment. It was the raw, ugly flush of a man watching a timeline collapse in real time. The brooch on my lapel was cool against my fingers when I touched it briefly instinctively, the gesture disguised as straightening my blazer. Everything being said at this table was being recorded. Every word Evan had just spoken about the power of attorney document, every direction Claire had steered the conversation, all of it accumulating quietly in a device no larger than a coat button, doing its work with a patience that matched my own. Sophie set her fork down. The sound of it touching the plate was small and clear in the sudden quiet, and every adult at the table heard it. She was looking at her mother, then at me, then at the glass of pear electrolyte water sitting untouched near the edge of the table, which I had not moved back toward my plate all evening. Then she looked at Claire again, with the searching directness of someone who has decided that the discomfort of adults is not her responsibility. And she said, "But Grandma remembers everything. She remembered the name of my freshman advisor the first week of my semester, when I was still mixing up the building numbers. She remembered Dad's birthday when you forgot to get a cake." Sophie's brow furrowed, genuinely puzzled, entirely deliberate. "How come you keep telling everyone she doesn't remember things anymore? That's not true." The greenhouse went completely still. Claire's face did something I had not seen it do in 39 years. It did not perform. For one unguarded, unscripted second, it simply reacted, the jaw tightening, the eyes hardening into something that had no warmth in it at all, directed at her own 8-year-old daughter, with a coldness that made my blood run cold on Sophie's behalf. "Sophie." Claire's voice came out stripped of its warmth, each syllable clipped and final. "Sophie, leave the table. Right now." Sophie blinked. Her bottom lip trembled, once the involuntary quiver of a child who has said something true and been punished for it, and then she pressed it flat and lifted her chin with a dignity that made my heart ache with a ferocity I was not prepared for. "But Mom, I was just—" "Room, now." Claire pointed toward the door to the house, her arm rigid, her finger unwavering. Sophie pushed back her chair and stood. She looked at me once before she went one long, steady look that said everything a child could not yet put into words. I looked back at her and gave the smallest possible nod, just enough to let her know that I had heard her, that what she said mattered, that she was not wrong. She walked through the greenhouse door with her shoulders straight and her chin up, and I watched her go, and felt the particular grief of someone who understood completely and finally exactly what kind of person Claire had become. The greenhouse felt different after Sophie left. Smaller somehow, as though the only person in the room who had been breathing real air had just walked out, and the rest of us were left managing on whatever was recycled. Claire returned to her seat with the deliberate composure of a woman pulling herself back together one vertebra at a time. She lifted her wine glass, took a measured sip, and looked at Mara with an expression that said, "Continue." Mara obliged, smoothing the assessment papers back into order with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to conversations interrupted by inconvenient truths. "As I was saying," Mara resumed, "the recommended next step would be a formal capacity evaluation conducted by a panel of—" "Before we continue," I said, "I'd like to ask you something, Mara." She stopped, set the papers flat on the table. Her expression rearranged itself into polite receptiveness, but her eyes, those eyes I had been watching all evening, sharpened by a fraction. "In your 12 years of consulting," I said, and I looked at her the way I had once looked at a painting a client swore was original, Audubon's steady patient, giving nothing away while taking everything in. "Have you ever worked with a family where the person being assessed asked better questions than the assessors?" The table went taut as a wire. Mara produced a smile that was perfectly constructed and completely hollow. "Mrs. Whitlock, I understand this process can feel confrontational. That's natural. But everything we're discussing tonight comes from a place of genuine concern for your well-being," I finished for her. "Yes, I've heard that word several times tonight." I set both hands flat on the table, palms down, and looked at her without any pleasantness left in my expression, at all just clarity, clean and direct as winter light. "You and I both know what this evening is actually about. I think we can afford to be honest about that even if no one else at this table can." Mara's jaw tightened. It was the second time tonight that particular muscle had betrayed her, and this time she did not look at Claire for rescue. She looked back at me, and what passed between us in that moment was not a conversation. It was a recognition. Two women who understood each other completely and had opposing reasons to be in this room. It was Evan who broke it, because Evan had never in 11 years demonstrated the capacity to leave a silence alone when he was frightened. "This is getting nowhere," he said, pushing back from the table and standing up too fast, the bourbon catching up with the motion, making him grab the back of his chair for a half second before he steadied. "I'm going to get another drink. And when I come back, we're going to finish this conversation like adults." He moved to the drinks table against the far wall, his steps slightly too careful in the way of a man monitoring his own gait. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon, knocked it back, poured another. His hands were not steady. The neck of the bottle clicked against the rim of the glass twice. Then he turned back toward the table, and in the particular combination of bourbon and anxiety and the pressing arithmetic of a 9-day deadline, he reached out and picked up the glass nearest to him on the edge of the table. The pale gold liquid inside caught the fairy light overhead. He drank. Not a sip, a long swallow, the way a thirsty man drinks, the way a desperate man drinks, the way a man drinks when he is not paying attention to what is in the glass, because his attention is entirely consumed by what is in his head. I watched him do it. I watched Claire watch him do it. I watched the exact moment Claire's eyes tracked from Evan's hand to the glass, to the empty spot on the table where that glass had been sitting untouched since I pushed it there with my napkin over an hour ago. Claire's face went the color of old chalk. She was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand, one hand reaching toward Evan across the table, her mouth opening around words she was trying to decide whether to say or swallow. "Evan, are you?" she started. "I'm fine," he said, setting the glass down and dragging the back of his hand across his mouth. "I'm completely fine. I just need everyone to stop." "That wasn't your—" Claire began and then stopped herself. Hard. The way you stop a car at the edge of something. But the sentence had started. And in this room, at this table, with the brooch on my lapel recording every syllable with its small patient eye, a sentence that starts does not need to finish to mean something. I watched Claire press both palms flat on the table and draw a careful breath. I watched her reconstruct her composure piece by piece, the way someone rebuilds a wall after a section has come loose. Her eyes moved to mine, and for just a moment, behind all the architecture of the evening, behind the warm lighting and the good china, and the 12 years of a relationship I had believed was the most real thing in my life, I saw something I had not expected. She looked frightened, not calculating, not cold. Genuinely nakedly frightened, the fear of someone watching a plan that has taken months to build begin to develop a crack it cannot absorb. My chest ached with the complexity of it. I did not feel triumph. I felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been right about something they desperately wished they had been wrong about. Evan set both hands on the table and blinked. Once. Twice. Then he pressed 2 fingers to his temple with a small frown, as though a sound had started somewhere behind his eyes that he was trying to locate. Before I reveal the one sentence that destroyed everything Claire had spent months building, do you think Marianne saw it coming? Comment yes or no right now before I continue. This story contains fictional elements shaped for entertainment and education. If it is not the right fit for you, stepping away is completely fine, but if you are staying, the next part is worth every second. Evan blinked again. The motion was slower this time, heavier, the way a person blinks when the air around them has thickened into something their body cannot quite process. He pulled both hands off the table and pressed them flat against his thighs, and I watched him try to recalibrate, try to reassemble the alert, pressured man he had been 20 minutes ago and fail at it by a degree that was becoming impossible to ignore. "I'm going to get some water," he announced to the table in general, and stood up. His chair scraped back. He took one step toward the drinks table and put a hand on the back of the nearest chair to steady himself, the movement so natural in its casualness that someone not watching closely might have read it as nothing more than a man steadying himself after sitting too long. But I was watching closely. His forearm was trembling. The tremor ran from the elbow down to the wrist, fine and continuous like a current moving through wire. Mara saw it too. I watched her eyes track the tremor and then move immediately to Claire, sharp and urgent, a silent alarm being sent across the table. Claire had already risen halfway from her seat. "Evan, sit down," she said, and her voice had shed its dinner-party warmth entirely. It was thin now, tightly controlled, with an edge beneath it, like metal under pressure. "You don't need more water, just—" "I'm fine," he said too quickly, too loud for the room. "I just need a minute." He took another step, reached out toward the drinks table. His fingers found a glass, not the bourbon, not the water pitcher, but a second glass that had been sitting at the far corner of the serving table, a glass that Claire had set there earlier in the evening, and that I had been aware of since the moment I entered this room, because I had been aware of every vessel and every surface in this room since 7 o'clock. Claire moved, fast, sharp around the end of the table, her heel catching the stone floor with a crack that cut through the room, and she reached out and closed her hand around Evan's arm before he could bring the glass to his lips. "Evan, stop." He looked at her. His eyes were slightly unfocused now, the pupils carrying that particular dilation that comes when the body is responding to something it has not been told about. "Claire, I am telling you, I just need—" "That is not water." Her voice dropped to something fierce and low and private, the voice of someone trying to contain a catastrophe in a whisper. But whispers in a room this size with these ceilings do not stay private. "What do you mean that's not water?" he said, and his voice cracked on the last word, not with the sharpness of a man who understood, but with the rising, confused alarm of a man who was beginning to suspect that some of what was wrong with him tonight might not be the bourbon after all. He looked at the glass in her hand, looked at her face, looked back at the glass. "Claire, what was in the glass I had before?" Claire's face was the color of unfinished plaster. She grabbed the glass from the serving table, turned it away from him, turned it away from the table. Her jaw clenched so hard the muscle along her cheeks stood out like a cord. "Nothing," she said. "It was nothing. Just sit down." Evan pulled his arm free from her grip and staggered back one step, not from force, but from the loss of the anchor her hand had provided. "I drank something," he said, and his voice was climbing now, hoarse and frightened, the voice of a man whose body was sending reports he had no framework to interpret. "I drank something off the table, and now I can't. My head is—" He reached out for the back of the chair again. This time he needed it. Claire spun around. Her eyes found the spot on the table where the pear electrolyte glass had been the spot that was now empty, the spot where I had pushed that glass with my napkin an hour and 15 minutes ago. Then her eyes came to me, and I watched the exact moment the full shape of the evening arranged itself behind her eyes. Not the shape she had planned, the shape that had actually occurred. She crossed to me in 4 steps, her voice dropping to something that was barely controlled. Fury pressed into a hiss. "What did you do with that glass?" "I moved it out of my way during dinner," I said calmly. "It was crowding my plate." "Where is it now?" I looked at the napkin beside my plate, folded once, covering nothing. The glass that had been there was the glass Evan had taken from the Meppy Bon when he stood up. I had watched him take it. I had not stopped him because I had needed that glass to go somewhere. It would tell the truth about what it contained, and it had. Claire understood. I could see her understand it, watch the comprehension move through her, like a wave moving through something solid, reshaping as it went. "Mom," her voice broke. Not with grief, with something more unhinged than grief, the fracturing sound of a plan collapsing under its own weight. "You had no right to. Evan needs medical attention," I said, cutting across her with a clarity I had been holding in reserve all evening, sharp and clean as a line drawn with a proper tool. "That is the priority right now." Evan made a sound low, involuntary, and gripped the chair with both hands. His knuckles had gone white, sweat had broken across his forehead, and the color had drained from his face with the completeness of a tide going out, leaving behind the gray, waxy look of a man whose body was working against him. Claire wheeled towards him, hands reaching, caught between the disaster on one side of the table and the one she had just registered on the other. She grabbed his shoulder. "Evan, look at me. Look at me." And then from somewhere in the blur of her panic, she did the thing she had been holding back for 30 seconds with everything she had. Her head turned back toward the table, toward the empty space where the glass had been, and the words came out of her in a sharp, involuntary burst, the way a sound escapes when the hand that was covering it slips, "Not that glass." 3 words. They left her mouth and hit the air and could not be retrieved. The fairy lights kept on trembling overhead. The candles kept on burning. The brooch on my lapel kept on recording, as patient and precise as it had been since 7 o'clock. I reached up, unclipped the brooch from my lapel, set it on the table in front of me, face up in the center of the white linen where every person in the room could see it. Then I looked at Claire. "Do you want to tell me," I said quietly, "what was in that glass?" Claire stared at the brooch. It was small, no larger than a coat button, lying face up on the white linen with the particular stillness of something that had been doing its work quietly all evening and had no need to announce itself now. She stared at it the way a person stares at something their brain is refusing to categorize correctly, because categorizing it correctly would require accepting everything that came with it. Then she looked at me, and the person looking back at me from behind my daughter's eyes was not the woman who had cooked this meal, or strung these lights, or rehearsed that warm, unhurried speech about family and care and the future. The person looking back at me was someone I had caught only in glimpses tonight, cold and calculating and frightened in equal measure, like an animal that has just realized the trap it thought it was setting was never meant for its prey at all. "That is a recording device," she said. Her voice was flat, stripped of everything. "It is," I said. "You came here tonight wearing a recording device." Her voice climbed one register, a crack of something unhinged running through it. "You sat at my table and you let us talk," I said. "Yes, I let you talk. That seemed like the right decision." "Mom!" The word came out of her in a way that broke my heart even now, even after everything, because it still sounded like the word a child uses when they are frightened and cannot think of anything else. "You don't understand what you've done." "Claire." I kept my voice level, but I let her hear the full weight behind it, the weight of 39 years of every school morning and every fever and every phone call on a Tuesday afternoon that I had believed was love. "I understand exactly what I have done. The question is whether you understand what you have done." She pressed both hands against the edge of the table, leaning forward, her knuckles white and shaking. "Everything I did was for this family." "No." I said it simply without heat, because the simplest words are sometimes the ones that cut the deepest. "Everything you did was for the money, for Evan's debt, for a timeline set by a man named Reed Calder, who doesn't know my name and doesn't care whether I live in my own home or in a locked room at Silver Magnolia." I paused. "That is not family. That is arithmetic." Claire's face crumpled, not into tears, into something uglier and more honest than tears, the expression of a person whose constructed version of their own story has just been taken apart in front of them and they have nothing left to replace it with. Her mouth opened and closed once, twice, and what came out was barely a whisper. "She told me you took everything from us," she said, and her eyes cut to Mara with a sudden raw fury that surprised even me. "She told me that you and Julian built your life on what belonged to her, that I was supposed to be here in this house with this family, and you stole it." Mara had risen from her chair. She was gathering the assessment papers from the table with the brisk, practiced efficiency of a woman who had been in rooms that fell apart before and knew exactly how to exit them. Her face was composed, professional, entirely detached, the face of someone who had already begun calculating the next step. "I think this evening has reached a natural conclusion," she said smoothly. "Sit down." My voice came out with a quiet authority that stopped her mid-motion. "You are not leaving this room." Mara looked at me, and I looked back at her, at the woman who had spent 39 years nursing a grievance into a weapon, who had found my daughter and handed that weapon to her and called it justice. There was nothing I could say to Mara Voss that would mean anything to her, so I said only this. "Whatever Julian owed you, and I believe he owed you a great deal, he did not owe you my life, and she did not have the right to try to take it." Something moved across Mara's face then, something that was not quite guilt and not quite shame, but lived in the neighborhood of both a flinch so brief and so quickly suppressed that I might have missed it if I had not been watching her all evening with the full attention of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to see what people tried not to show. She sat down. Sat. A sound from the other side of the table pulled every eye in the room. Evan had sunk into his chair, both arms on the armrests, his head dropping forward. The sweat on his forehead had gone from a sheen to something heavier, and his breathing had taken on the slow, deliberate quality of a man working very hard to stay functional. "Claire," he said, and his voice had the thick, muzzy quality of someone speaking through water. "Something's wrong. Something is actually wrong." Claire wheeled towards him, her hands reaching for his face, tipping his chin up to look at her. Evan, stay with me. Look at me." "I need—" He stopped, blinked. The blink was too slow. "I don't feel right." My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I reached in and drew it out. An email notification from an address I did not recognize, except that the subject line was written in the large, uneven capitals of a child who had learned to type recently and was still putting everything in uppercase. The subject read, "Grandma, I am sending you this. Sophie." My Sophie upstairs in her room with her iPad, who had looked at me across the table all evening with those wide brown eyes that missed nothing and forgotten nothing, and loved me without condition or calculation. My Sophie had been doing her own quiet work, while the adults downstairs tore the evening apart. I pressed the phone against my chest. My eyes burned. A tear broke loose before I could stop it. Just one running down the side of my face, in the warm, trembling light of the fairy lights, and I let it go, because some things deserve to be felt without apology. Then, from the direction of the front door, came the sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor of the hallway. More than one set, moving with the unhurried certainty of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had finally been given the signal to walk through the door. Graham came through the greenhouse door first, and the sight of him solid, unhurried, his dark suit carrying the particular authority of a man who had made his decision days ago and arrived tonight simply to deliver its consequences, hit me somewhere behind the ribs with a relief so physical it was almost painful. He was not alone. The woman who came in directly behind him moved the way people move when they have walked into rooms like this many times before and have stopped needing to brace themselves for what they find inside. Detective Angela Rowe was perhaps 50, with close-cropped dark hair and a face that had learned to stay neutral so thoroughly it had become its natural expression. She wore a dark jacket over a plain shirt, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone whose presence alone changes the atmosphere of a room not through intimidation, but through the simple, unmistakable fact of competence. At her shoulder came Lila Monroe, younger than her voice had suggested over the phone, with steady hands and the contained expression of someone who had been frightened for several weeks and had finally reached the moment where all of that fear converted into something clean and purposeful. I had spoken to Lila on the phone 2 hours ago. Hearing her was one thing. Seeing her standing in this room she had never been in this house she had never visited, having done what she did entirely on behalf of a woman she had never formally met, made something in my chest go loose and warm in a way I had not anticipated. Angela stepped forward without hesitation and placed a folded document on the table beside the assessment papers Mara had not finished collecting. The sound of it landing on the white linen was small and final, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Detective Angela Rowe, Charleston Police Department Financial Crimes and Elder Exploitation Unit. Her voice was level and carried without effort, reaching every corner of the greenhouse without needing to rise. I have a search warrant for this property and a court order authorizing the seizure of physical and digital evidence relevant to an ongoing investigation into financial fraud and unlawful administration of a substance. She looked at each face at the table, in turn unhurried, giving everyone the full weight of her attention. I also have a court order requiring the immediate preservation of all financial documents, medical records, and communications related to the accounts and assets of Marianne Whitlock. Claire made a sound that was not a word, something raw and involuntary that came from somewhere below. Language the sound of a person who has been holding a structure upright by force for months and has just felt the first support give way. Her hands flew to the edge of the table as if she needed it to hold her upright. "You cannot do this." Her voice cracked across the room, thin and fraying at the edges. "This is my house. You need Graham. You brought the police to my house. You have no right." "Claire." Graham's voice was quiet, but it carried the particular firmness of a man who had made his peace with this moment long before it arrived. "I strongly advise you not to say anything further without an attorney present." "Don't tell me what to do." She was shaking now, her whole frame trembling with the effort of containing something too large for the body holding it. "You worked for my father for 20 years. You stood at his funeral. How can you stand there and—" "I worked for Julian," Graham said, "and I am doing exactly what Julian asked me to do." The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest thing in the room. Angela set a compact speaker on the table beside the warrant document and connected it to her phone. She looked at me, a brief, direct glance, a question without words. I nodded once. She pressed play. The voice that came out of the speaker was Claire's voice, stripped of every layer of warmth and performance she had constructed for this evening, caught in the one unguarded second when the hand covering the truth had finally slipped, not that glass. 3 words. In this room with these people in the warm, trembling light of the fairy lights, Claire had strung with such careful intent, those 3 words landed like a verdict read aloud in a courtroom. Claire's face went to the color of old plaster. Her mouth opened. Her breath came in audible, ragged pulls, and the tears that broke through were not the graceful tears of a woman who had been wronged. They were the shaking, devastating tears of someone whose version of the story has just been dismantled in front of everyone she thought she controlled. "That is not," she started. "That is not what it—" "Claire." Angela's voice was not unkind, but it was immovable. "I need you to stop speaking without counsel. That is not a suggestion." I reached up and touched the brooch on my lapel, the camera pin that had been doing its quiet, patient work since 7 o'clock. I unclipped it, held it for a moment in my palm, feeling its slight weight, its cool silver surface, the extraordinary amount of truth it contained in a space smaller than a coat button. Then I leaned forward and placed it on the table in front of Angela. "This was recording from 7 p.m., I said. "Continuous, including Evan Pierce's statement about the power of attorney document and the statement made by Ms. Bell regarding my capacity to execute legal documents after tonight." Angela picked it up carefully, bagged it, and labeled it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had handled evidence 1,000 times. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitlock." Lila had crossed to Evan's side of the table. She crouched beside his chair, 2 fingers at his wrist, her eyes tracking his face with the focused attention of someone conducting an assessment in real time. "His pulse is steady," she said to Angela, her voice calm and factual. "Elevated sedation consistent with valerian passion flower compound combined with alcohol. He needs monitoring and fluid support, but he is not in immediate danger." She looked up at Claire briefly without expression. "The paramedics will handle it from here." Claire pressed both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders heaved. She looked at Evan, gray-faced, barely present in his chair, and something in her face broke in a way that was beyond performance, beyond strategy, beyond anything she had planned for this evening. Whatever she had told herself about what she was doing, and why the sight of her husband slumped in that chair, was the one thing that reached beneath all of it. "Evan," she whispered. "Evan, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It wasn't supposed to—" "Claire." Mara's voice came from the far end of the table, sharp and low, a warning. "Stop talking." Claire looked at Mara with an expression I had never seen on her face in 39 years. Naked, uncomplicated fury. The fury of someone who has just understood the full cost of the alliance they made. "Don't tell me what to do," she said, and her voice had a new quality in it, something raw and broken that had not been there before. "You told me this would work. You told me it was clean." Mara looked back at her with the composed, measuring gaze of a woman who had already mentally exited this room and was calculating her next position. "I want to speak with an attorney," she said to Angela. "That is your right," Angela said. "We will arrange that." 2 uniformed officers had positioned themselves near the greenhouse exits. One spoke quietly into his radio. From the front of the house, growing steadily louder, came the sound of an ambulance pulling to the curb. Graham came to stand beside me. He did not speak. He simply stood there, solid and present, and carrying the full weight of 23 years of loyalty in a way that required no words, and I was more grateful for that silence than I could have expressed in any language. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I drew it out. The screen showed an email notification from an address I did not recognize, but the subject line was written in the careful, deliberate uppercase of someone who wanted to be absolutely certain it would be opened. "Grandma, I am sending you this." I pressed the email open. The attachment was an audio file, 42 seconds. I held the phone to my ear. The voice in the recording was composed professional and entirely certain of itself. It was Mara Voss, and what she said in those 42 seconds, captured from a staircase by a 19-year-old girl with a phone and the quiet courage to stay, when every instinct must have told her to run, was this: after tonight she won't be able to sign anything. We just need this one last piece and the filing is done. I lowered the phone. I looked at the room around me, at the beautiful lights, at the good china, at the assessment papers fanned across the white linen, at Claire sitting with her face in her hands, at Mara sitting with her hands flat on the table, and her eyes on a middle distance that had nothing left to offer her. I looked at Graham. I looked at Lila. I looked at Angela, who was already reaching for her own phone. "I'll forward that to you now," I said. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitlock," Angela said. "That is exactly what we needed." I pressed send. Outside, the ambulance doors opened. The fairy lights kept on trembling overhead, beautiful and indifferent, and completely unchanged, as though the room they were illuminating was still the room Claire had planned. It was not. Angela had asked me to move to the main sitting room while her team worked the greenhouse, and I was grateful for it, not because I could not bear to stay, but because I had been in that room for 2 hours and 40 minutes, holding myself together with nothing but will and the knowledge that falling apart was not something I could afford until the work was finished. The work was finished now. I walked through the connecting hallway without looking at the family photographs on the wall, and I sat down on the sofa Claire and I had chosen together 6 years ago at an estate sale on King Street, and I let my spine find the back cushion and stay there. The sitting room was quieter. A single floor lamp in the corner threw amber light across the coffee table, and the smell of the house in the hour after dinner. Warm and thinning the candles from the greenhouse, no longer reaching this far, was ordinary in the way that only domestic things can be. Ordinary, indifferent to everything that had just occurred 20 feet away. Lila came in first and sat in the armchair across from me without being asked, which told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person she was. She did not offer words. She simply sat steady and present, her hands quiet on her knees, and let the silence be the thing it needed to be, not empty, but full of the particular companionship of someone who understands that some moments do not require filling. I looked at her properly for the first time. Early 30s, an open, direct face that made you believe her immediately, the kind of face that had never learned to perform composure because it had never needed to composure, was simply what it did. After everything she had navigated over the past weeks, the doubt, the careful documentation, the quiet courage of making a call she had no professional obligation to make, her hands were completely still. "You came," I said. It was not sufficient. I knew it was not sufficient, but it was the truest thing I had. "Of course I came," she said, and her voice was gentle and completely certain, the voice of someone who had made their decision long before tonight and was not interested in being thanked for it. "I wasn't going to let you walk into that room alone." My throat tightened until it ached. "You didn't know me," I said. "You had no obligation." "Mrs. Whitlock." She leaned forward slightly, her elbows on her knees, her eyes holding mine with a directness that left no room for deflection. "What was being done to you was wrong. That determination does not require a personal relationship. It only requires paying attention." She paused. I was paying attention. I pressed my lips together hard and breathed through the burn behind my eyes. I was not going to cry in front of this woman who had held herself together for weeks on my behalf. I was going to save that for later when I was alone and had the full privacy of my own kitchen to fall apart in. "Thank you, Lila," I said. "I mean every syllable of that." Graham came in from the hallway carrying his leather document case, moving with the particular careful exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has only just been given permission to set it down. He sat in the armchair beside Lila, placed the case on the coffee table, and opened it without preamble because Graham Vale had never in 23 years confused ceremony for efficiency. He laid 2 documents on the table between us. "Angela has everything she needs," he said. "The electrolyte bottle Lila preserved from the clinic has been submitted for analysis. The lab will confirm the valerian passion flower concentration within 48 hours. The timestamp discrepancy in Greer's assessment has already been flagged. He drew a steady breath. Oscar Dane provided his preserved dashcam footage this morning. 6 documented meetings between Claire and Mara Voss at the Pelican Bay Motor Inn over 3 months. He looked at me over the document. And Nina Brooks at Coastal Heritage Bank delivered her written signature analysis to Angela's office at 2 o'clock this afternoon. 17 measurable deviations from your documented specimens. That is not a borderline case. That is a fabricated document. Each piece of evidence landed with the weight of something that had been assembled quietly, patiently by people who had no stake in the outcome except the belief that the outcome should be correct. I felt the full weight of that, the way you feel something that has been protecting you before you knew it was there. Dr. Greer, I asked. Summoned for questioning tomorrow morning, Graham said. His medical license is under review pending the investigation. Angela has already contacted the South Carolina Board of Medical Examiners. His jaw tightened. Vivian Cross at Silver Magnolia has been formally notified. The holding deposit Claire placed has been flagged as part of the fraud investigation. And Reed Calder, I asked. Angela's unit is handling that separately, Graham said. Calder's operation has been on their radar for some time. Evan's involvement gives them additional grounds. He paused, and something in his expression told me he was choosing his next words with the precision of a man who understood that some sentences could not be unsaid. Evan is at MUSC. His condition is stable. He will be questioned when he is medically cleared. I nodded. I absorbed that without comment because there was nothing useful I could add to it tonight. Graham picked up the first document and turned it toward me. The header read, Whitlock Family Trust Protective Provision, Activation Notice, November 26, 2025. Julian's clause has been triggered, he said, and his voice roughened on Julian's name in the way it always did, the involuntary roughness of a man who had genuinely grieved his client and had never entirely stopped. Claire Whitlock Pierce is formally disqualified from any benefit under the Whitlock Family Trust, effective tonight under the terms Julian established in October 2014. The trust principal remains under independent administration. Your assets are fully protected, Marianne. Every single one. The relief that moved through me was not triumphant. It was quieter than that, the deep, bone-level relief of a woman who has been standing on uncertain ground for months and has just felt solid floor return beneath her feet. My eyes burned. I let them burn. He held, I said quietly, meaning Julian, meaning the thing he had built in the last year of his life when he finally understood what his silence might cost me. After everything he held, Graham confirmed, and the simplicity of it, 2 words, no embellishment, was more than sufficient. He picked up the second document. This is the activation notice for Sophie's custodial education fund. Julian established it as a separate provision within the trust completely independent of her parents, administered by my office as neutral trustee. It cannot be accessed, redirected, or claimed by Claire or Evan under any circumstance. He slid it across the coffee table toward me. Sophie has a fund. Whatever happens in the months ahead, that fund is hers, and it is untouchable. Something broke open behind my sternum, not painfully, but the way a window opens in spring suddenly and with relief. My hand came up to my mouth. I thought of Sophie sitting at that dinner table with her notebook, watching everything saying the true thing when saying the true thing cost her something. I thought of her on that staircase in the dark, with her phone recording a conversation she should never have had to hear sending it to me. Because she understood at 19 years old, she understood that the truth needed a carrier. Julian thought of her, I said, and my voice failed on the last word, just barely. He thought of everyone he was afraid of failing, Graham said quietly. That was the kind of man he became at the end. Angela appeared in the doorway. She looked at me with the professional steadiness that had not left her face once since she walked through the greenhouse door and beneath it, just briefly, just enough something human. Mrs. Whitlock, she said. Claire and Ms. Voss will be transported to the station shortly for formal questioning. You are free to go whenever you are ready. A pause. Is there someone who can drive you home? I stood up, my legs held. My spine was straight. The cream wool blazer was still buttoned, the brooch no longer on my lapel, but sitting in an evidence bag doing its final work. I thought of my kitchen on Battery Row, of the rosemary pot on the windowsill, of Julian's silver laurel brooch in the bedroom drawer, waiting to be pinned back where it belonged. "No," I said. "I know the way." The kitchen was the first thing I recognized as mine again. Not the hallway that still smelled faintly of last night's coat, rain damp, and adrenaline. Not the bedroom I'd barely touched the pillow before sitting upright at 3 a.m. with my heart hammering like I'd forgotten to outrun something. But the kitchen, with its rosemary pot on the sill and the particular creak of the third floorboard near the refrigerator that was still mine, unchanged, untouched by any of them. I pressed my bare foot against that floorboard deliberately. It groaned its familiar greeting. Something behind my sternum unclenched by a single merciful degree. I put the kettle on. My hands were steadier than I expected them to be, though my knuckles ached from how hard I'd gripped the car door the night before. The morning light came through the window at a low November angle, pale gold, uncommitted, as if even the sun was taking its time deciding how much warmth the day deserved. On the counter sat the pear-flavored electrolyte bottle, the one Claire had first brought 6 weeks ago, replaced weekly with fresh ones, each delivered with that practiced smile and the words for your joints. Mom, Dr. Greer says hydration is critical at your age. I picked it up. I felt its weight, its familiar plastic yield. Then I walked to the trash can, lifted the lid, and dropped it in. The hollow clang it made against the metal bottom was the most satisfying sound I had heard in months. My phone rang. The screen read, Sophie. I answered before the second ring finished. "Good morning, sweetheart." "Grandma." Her voice was wrecked, thick and raw, like she'd been awake all night, pressing her face into a pillow to muffle sounds she didn't want anyone to hear. "I've been sitting on my bedroom floor for an hour. I didn't know who else to call." My throat tightened so fast it almost choked me. "Then you called exactly the right person," I said, and I meant it from somewhere so deep it surprised even me. "I keep hearing it." Her voice fractured. Evan, hitting the table edge when he fell. Mom screaming, "Not that glass," and then Grandma, her face. I've never seen her look like that, like something had broken inside her that she didn't know was there. My eyes burned. I pressed 2 fingers to my temple and breathed through it. "What you saw last night was the truth coming loose from where she'd buried it," I said quietly. "That kind of thing is ugly. It's supposed to be ugly. But Sophie, you did not flinch. You held that phone steady, and you sent that recording, and you saved a great deal more than just my evening." She made a sound, half laugh, half sob, that cracked right down the middle. I was shaking the entire time. My teeth were actually chattering. I thought Mara was going to see me on the stairs. But she didn't. "But she didn't," Sophie echoed, and I heard her take a long, jagged breath. "Listen to me," I said, leaning against the counter because my legs were not entirely reliable this morning. "I need you to hear this clearly. None of what your mother became is your fault, not one molecule of it. You are 19 years old, and you have more courage and more moral clarity than people 3 times your age, and I will not allow you to carry guilt that doesn't belong to you." Sophie burst into full, unguarded tears, the kind that pour out without ceremony, without apology, the kind that have been waiting behind a sealed door for far too long. I cried with her. My tears were quieter, the kind that come when you are 70 and have made a private peace with the fact that grief doesn't always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it just slides down your face while you're standing in your kitchen on a Thursday morning, holding your phone with both hands. When we'd both come back to ourselves slowly in stages, the way you surface from deep water, Sophie asked, her voice still fragile, "What happens to her now?" "That is the court's decision to make," I said, "not mine. I will tell the truth to whoever asks for it, and beyond that, I will not spend whatever years I have left deciding how much punishment your mother deserves. That would cost me more than she already has. And Graham the trust. Julian made sure," I said, and my voice caught on his name for just a moment, a small stumble, a familiar ache. "The trust is airtight. The scholarship fund for you is already separated clean in your name. Graham called me at 7 this morning to confirm." "He called you at 7? Sophie gave a tearful, disbelieving laugh. "On Thanksgiving." Graham Vale has never once in 23 years confused a holiday for an excuse, I said, and felt the first real smile of the morning move across my face, soft and genuine, and slightly waterlogged around the edges. A knock came at the back door. Through the glass, I saw Ruth Bellamy, tan gardening coat, sensible shoes, one hand holding a foil-covered dish, and the other raised in a small wave that managed to hold within it the entire weight of 20 years of friendship. "Someone's here," I told Sophie. "Come on, Sunday. Bring your appetite and your textbooks if you need them. My table will be exactly where you left it." "I'll be there," she said fiercely. "I love you, Grandma." "I love you," I said, "more than you can currently calculate." I opened the back door. Ruth stepped in without being asked. She never asks. She simply arrives, which is the highest form of friendship I know, and set the dish on the counter, sweet potato casserole. The smell of it, butter and cinnamon and something unmistakably like normal, hit the back of my throat and made my eyes sting all over again. "You look like you had quite a week," Ruth said plainly, studying my face with the frank, unsentimental gaze of someone who has seen me at my worst and shown up every time regardless. I let out a breath that had been waiting since November 26th. "I have had quite a week," I confirmed. She opened her arms. I stepped into them, not gracefully, not with any kind of dignity, just fully, and held on. She held back with the solid, uncomplicated warmth of someone who asks nothing except that you accept the casserole and let yourself be cared for. When I finally stepped back, I crossed to the windowsill, picked up Julian's silver laurel brooch and pinned it to my cardigan. The old habit, the last step before beginning. "Coffee?" I asked Ruth. "Obviously," she said. Outside the window, a mockingbird called twice from the magnolia tree. The November light shifted, brightened just slightly, and fell across the rosemary pot and the empty space where the electrolyte bottle had been. The space that was only empty now because I had finally put something down. I pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet and I began. If there is one thing these revenge family stories have taught me, not from a book but from living it, it is this: the people most capable of hurting you are the ones you never thought to protect yourself from. I am Marianne Whitlock. I spent 39 years loving a daughter who was never mine by blood, and I do not regret a single ordinary Tuesday of it. What I regret is staying blind when the signs were already written on the wall. Don't be like me. When something feels wrong inside your own home, trust that feeling before it costs you everything. My personal belief. Family stories of revenge are never really about money or inheritance. They are about people who stopped believing they were enough and decided to take what they couldn't build. I also believe with everything I have that God placed Julian's letter in that envelope at precisely the moment it needed to be found. Not luck, not coincidence. Grace. These revenge family stories exist to remind us: protect your peace, protect your name, and never sign anything you haven't read in full. If this story of Family Stories Revenge stayed with you, leave a comment below. I read every single one. Share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so the next story finds you first. Thank you for staying with me until the very last word. It means everything. Coming stories contain fictional elements crafted for entertainment and educational reflection. Any similarity to names or places is coincidental, but the lessons inside them are offered to you with complete sincerity.